Let me welcome you to what I believe is the first colloquium of 2026, which is taking place despite the efforts of nature to slow us down and so forth. I give it great pleasure to welcome Iris Berent, who has been to RuCCS before. Memory serves, it seemed a long time ago.
Twice before.
Yeah, twice before.
Yes.
All right. So I've collided these two in memory. So go back for a third. So this time will be completely different. My memory of the last time you were still working on phonology.
Correct.
So you did a lot of work on the cognitive psychology of phonology. But many people I don't know, maybe not so many people know, but of course linguistics used to be one of the leading centers in the world for phonology. Psychologists perhaps not really pay so much attention to that. It's an extraordinarily interesting part of linguistics, very rich and rich in a structural sense. I suppose it's just as much statistics as anything else, but structurally it's a very rich area of linguistic structure, and one of course that we pay very little attention to intuitively, because our motor system just seems to take care of this in a way that doesn't attract our notice. So the interest that Iris had in the various questions in the cognitive psychology of phonology were always the deep questions of what this would tell us about the nature of mind. Today, I think Iris is going to give us a completely different topic, but still these deep questions regarding our theory of mind, how our natural theory of mind influences all sorts of other kinds of opinions that we arrive at, and that colour, not least of all, the questions about innateness versus learning, and how perhaps we're really just a wee bit biased in these questions. I don't know, is it Jenny here? I would like for Jenny, because I know Jenny Wang's done some empirical work in this. I think Iris has, I don't know what you're going to talk about, but probably you're going to touch on me, so
Yes.
I should stop.
Yes.
And hand over to Iris.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be in this department who set the foundation for everything I will discuss today, including Alan's work. So wonderful. I'm super excited, and thank you for the invite. So we cognitive scientists are a feisty bunch. We throw at each other all kinds of accusations. There is the cherry picker, there is the weird chaser, there is the just so teller, but the worst offense of all is being the native, the dualist, worse of even being the nativist, right? For example, in this piece, Art Glenberg, defender of embodied cognition, and colleagues accused Fodor's physical symbol system hypothesis of dualism. He claims that it treats the mind as if it were disembodied, and to my knowledge, Fodor said no such thing. In fact, here he laments that if there is anything we philosophers really hate, it's untenable dualism. Exposing untenable dualism is a lot of what we do already. So, in this talk, dualism is the tacit belief that the mind is ethereal, distinct from the body. So here I'm specifically concerned with substance dualism. And this raises two sets of very different questions. And the first is about what exists. Is the mind really distinct from the body? So it's a question about ontology. This is usually what philosophers care about. But I'm a humble psychologists, and what I care about is what we perceive and know, and the question here is whether we perceive the mind as being distinct from the body. And it is quite possible that the answer to the two questions are different. We might perceive the mind as different from the body, perhaps when in reality it isn't. And in fact, I believe this is exactly what might be the case, and that we are subject to a delusion. Dualism might be a psychological delusion in the sense that it persists in the face of evidence to the contrary. So, in this talk, I will argue that yes, we are indeed intuitive dualists, and that being a dualist is natural. It emerges from innate systems of core knowledge, and in that sense, it's partly inevitable. It is no wonder then that dualism has such a bad rap. It ravages cognition, and most seriously, it distorts our understanding of our own human nature. I will illustrate the role of dualism in two of the most foundational problems in cognitive science, the nature-nurture wars and the hard problem of consciousness. But dualism is not all bad. I will end by speculative claims that dualism might actually be good for you, that it's adaptive. It shapes our conscious sense of self, and therefore changes to dualism could potentially explain psychopathology. This is part of a new book that will come next year. So that's it. So let's go for it. So as you think about it, several questions come to mind. Are we really intuitive dualists? How bad is it really? How pervasive are its effects? And of course, why? Why are we intuitive dualists? And I suggest that we start with this because I think that this will actually hold the key to the other questions. So how dualism arises? When people talk about dualism, it's commonplace to think that dualism is the consequence of religion. And there's no question that cultural transmission could play a role, right? That culture could be contribute to dualism. But the question is not whether it can, but rather whether it must. So is culture necessary for dualism to emerge? And when you think about it, you see that the logical error could also go the other way around, that perhaps religion is in fact the consequence of dualism rather than exclusively its cause. And so, but then you might want to ask, so how does dualism arise, right? That's the question. And about 20 years ago, Paul Bloom came with an interesting proposal. And what he suggested is that dualism could be natural, that it could emerge from the tension between two innate systems of core knowledge, intuitive physics on the one hand and theory of mind on the other. And we know about these systems thanks to Alan's work in part, as well as the work of Liz Spelke and Susan Carey. And these results tell us that each of those systems project different and conflicting principles to objects and to the minds of others. So intuitive physics tells us that objects, for example, interact only by contact. Theory of mind tells us that agents, their behavior, the movement of their body arises from mental states. So if I reach my hand to the bottle, it's because I have a desire that caused my hand to move and some belief about what's in the bottle, right? But the problem is that human bodies are also objects. So when you run the same story of theory of mind through intuitive physics, which views the hand as an object just like a ball, it's going to be completely baffled, right? How does the hand, the physical object, move? What object bumped into it and what caused it to move? Recognizing that, we will assume that whatever this mental state is, it can't be physical. It violates the laws of intuitive physics, and therefore, perhaps it's ethereal. So what you get here is a series of beliefs that starts with a rather modest claim that mind is simply different from body, that each abide by different causal principles. This is what core knowledge gives you. Recognizing the tension between them, you will get into the conclusion that mind, in fact, are not physical, that they are ethereal. And if I, the self, can cause these mental states to emerge, and if mind and body can't interact, then the causer must be ethereal as well. So I am ethereal. So there is a whole continuum of belief here. Dualism is not just a single claim, but actually a continuum of beliefs that begins with core knowledge, but doesn't end there. And the roots of all this are natural. They are anchored in core knowledge. And this proposal leads to some testable predictions, right? Because if dualism arises from the tension between these two systems, then if one of the systems, say theory of mind, were going to be attenuated, then the tension would be attenuated, and so would dualism, right? So to test it, all you need to do is find people whose theory of mind is not so great and ask what happens to their dualism. You would expect it to be attenuated. And again, thanks to Alan's work and others, we know that autistic people is one place to look for, because they are famously, they struggle with theory of mind, as do males relative to females cross-culturally. It's a small difference, but it is a consistent one. So if this is true, then you expect that the groups with weaker theory of mind, namely males and autistic peoples, would show weaker dualism, and that it will be proportional to the theory of mind. And by the way, stop me if I'm kind of, yeah? Okay. All right, so in my lab, we tested these ideas by subjecting people to two thought experiments: body replication and afterlife judgment. So body replication invite people to imagine a hypothetical scenario in which it were possible to create a full replica of a person that exactly copies every aspect of the person's body, including their brain. People are given a list of psychological traits, and the task is to determine which of those traits would emerge in the replica of the donor. The logic is, if a given psychological trait is in the body and you copy the body, that trait ought to replicate. So the question is, which traits are embodied? For the physicalist, the answer is everything. Everything, the mind is entirely anchored in the body. Even a dualist might think that some of our psychological traits are embodied, right? So if you think about action like squatting, well, that's in my legs, they'll tell you. And what about emotions, my fear? It's in my face, it's in my gut, that's where I feel it. But when you think about epistemic states, people don't really link them to the brain, so they think that they don't live in the body, they live somewhere else. So the idea is that if you're a dualist, then you might think that actions and emotions, collectively non-epistemic traits, ought to copy with the body, whereas since epistemic traits ain't there, then they won't copy to the duplicate. So are people dualists? So this is our litmus test. Do they consider epistemic traits as less likely to copy? And is this attenuated in people with weaker theory of mind? So we're going to test that in two groups. And let's look first at the autistic people compared to the neurotypicals. This is their body replication result. The proportion will emerge responses. Chance level is here. And autistic people are in dark, neurotypical, and two things that you see. First, across groups, people are dualist. Indeed, they consider epistemic traits as less likely to copy with the body compared to non-epistemic traits. Second, comparing the two groups, you see that autistic people overall are more likely to say that all psychological traits will copy with the body, suggesting that they are more embodied. So overall people are dualists, but autistic people are weaker, so weaker dualism and stronger physicalism. But maybe they just tell you yes, so maybe it's a yes bias. To find out, we will also present them with the converse situation, which is the afterlife. So in the after, people are asked to assume that there is an afterlife. If so, which of a person's traits would exist? The idea is that now the body is no more, so only traits that are possibly in the mind are candidates. So which one are they? Well, if people think that epistemic traits are really ethereal and they're not physical, then now these are the ones that are likely to emerge, whereas the non-epistemic traits are less likely to do so. So again, are people showing signs of dualism, and is it attenuated in autistic people? Afterlife results are here. This is body replication for reminder. And now you see that people say that overall epistemic traits are more likely to emerge, and that Schick suggests that indeed they are dualist. Furthermore, while neurotypical people are certain that epistemic traits will emerge at all times, this is not the case for autistic people who are kind of not sure. So this is in line with the claim that indeed autistic people show weaker dualism. Same thing when you look at males versus females. So in body replication, epistemic traits are overall less likely to emerge. In afterlife, they are more likely to emerge. Again, evidence for dualism. Looking at males in dark, you see that in body replication, they believe that once you copy the body, the entire psyche is more likely to replicate. So they view the psyche as embodied, whereas that's not the case when you don't have it, when you actually can only maintain the mind in the afterlife. So, in conclusion, groups with weaker theory of mind are less dualist. That is true for autistic people as well as males. Dualism also correlates with theory of mind. Look at the paper if you want. Caution, the usual caution, correlation and causation. We don't know whether theory of mind is causal, but it's consistent with this possibility, and it suggests that dualism is natural. Now, if you take this belief or this conclusion seriously, then you must ask, is it only us, or is it other species that are dualist? So, could animals be dualist? Now, you think this is anthropomorphism. It ain't, right? I just told you, if it's really the case that dualism emerges from theory of mind, then if other animals have theory of mind and core physics, then the tension could very well emerge. And there is tons of literature that shows theory of mind and intuitive physics. So this is very few from many, many references that I review in my book. Evidence for core physics in chicks, in primates, evidence for theory of minds in dogs, in European jays, in chimps, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So, given this evidence, you have to ask, are animals dualist? Well, surprise, surprise, nobody's done those experiments. Nonetheless, there is some anecdotal evidence. And one piece of anecdotal evidence is animals' conflicting reaction to dead conspecifics. So remember, bodies for the dualists are ambiguous, that ought to elicit conflicting behaviors. And that is exactly what you see when you look at how animals treat dead corpse. There is a lot of evidence that mothers keep carrying their dead infants for at great cost for themselves. So this is this whale who was carrying her infant all over the world virtually, and it's not easy for her to do. And this is not because she doesn't know it's dead. There is a ton of evidence that it does, and that the behavior towards the dead is different, including some behaviors that are only usually directed towards objects, such as tossing and, sorry, but even nibbling. So the same mother who will carry her infants will occasionally carry it and nibble on it, which is exactly what you would expect by this idea that that animals might be dualist at a very rudimentary level. So either it's probably just at the very level of minds and bodies are only distinct. This is anecdotal, so we don't know. Somebody needs to do it. I think it's worth looking into. So, yeah, maybe dualism is natural. Perhaps it's even old phylogenetically. And, yeah. So, looking at that, You may not be convinced. Dualism, really? I ain't no dualist. I'm a scientist. I don't do this stuff. I don't think this way. I said the same until I started really paying attention and seeing how I do this all the time under the hood, notwithstanding my beliefs. So, is it the case? Could you still be a closet dualist? We decided to test, and we use a brief implicit association task as follows. So in brief implicit association task, you're getting a word, a target word, along with two buckets, and you have to say, does it belong to either? If it does, you say yes. If it belongs to neither, you say no. The logic is, if those two buckets are associated, your life will be easier. And through that, you can tell what is associated. In particular, do you associate body with the physical? And more importantly, do you associate mind with not physical, with the ethereal? So, to look at that, we presented people with body words like leg, along with the categories body, and an attribute that is associated with body. What is associated with body? Intuitive physics tells us bodies are solid. So body and solid should be congruent. And compared it with something that's not solid. And we decided to take airy, which should be incongruent. So you would expect that responses should be easier when body is associated with solid compared to airy. This is what happened. This is sensitivity D prime. Responses to body are more sensitive with solid compared to airy. They are also faster with solid compared to airy. Well, this is not huge surprise. Bodies are solid either way. But what about minds, right? So now we're presented with mind words such as knowledge, belief, ideas, opinions, and these are the solid words, airy are wine, fume, smoke, steam. Same thing, and now you would expect the opposite, right? That knowledge should do better with airy compared to solid. Very strong crossover interaction. For mind, people are more sensitive with airy compared to solid, and they are also faster with airy compared to solid. So people are tacit dualists. But then we wanted to ask, are they also closet dualists? So will they fall for dualism, or will they endorse dualism even when they tell you that they ain't no dualists? So we asked them, what do you think about the afterlife? And what do you think, is the mind the same as the body? And we chose only those participants who did not endorse dualism and looked at the brief implicit association task results. There weren't too many people like that, but they looked basically exactly like everybody else. This study was pre-registered, strong evidence for dualism in both cases. So yes, you are likely a closet dualist, even if you believe otherwise, and dualist intuitions are fast and possibly automatic. And if that's the case, then you won't be surprised that dualism would really mess up with your cognition, that its tolls on cognition are going to be found everywhere. And indeed, when you look at the literature, and this is just a very small sample, there are kind of bad bodies lying there all over the place on the floor. Dualism is linked to supernatural beliefs, to beliefs about free will and criminal justice, to the seductive allure of neuroscience, stigma towards psychiatric disorders, and yes, AI companions. So in what universe do you think that you're going to marry a disembodied AI? I think that if you're a dualist, it makes sense for you to do so. But I haven't tested that. But in my mind, the most serious toll of dualism is that it really obscures our human nature from ourselves. And I want to demonstrate in two really serious problems, in the nature-nurture wars and in the hard problem of consciousness. So for this group, I probably don't need to spend lots of time convincing you that people are empiricists. you know of Jenny's work, and we publish our work together, which is great because now you know it's a thing. Yes, lay people are empiricists. So briefly, the way we looked at that, first to summarize their intuitions, people have no troubles understanding the two hands are innate, the perception, actions, emotions are possibly innate. But when you tell them about innate knowledge, they just give you the look. They don't think that knowledge could possibly be innate. For example, one way to show that is to invite people to play scientist and ask them, what do you think newborns know? And what we did is presented them with detailed descriptions of published research from the infant cognition literature along with the rationale and method, and asked them to predict what would infants do in this situation. The logic is that if people think that those traits are innate, then they could emerge at birth. They don't have to, but they possibly could. So for example, this is a vignette modeled after the Izzard et al. Number cognition experiment with some changes to make it more palatable to lay people. So we told them, in the study we're going to examine whether newborn infants have an understanding of number. To study that, researchers have presented them with a certain number of sounds and a certain number of lights. And the idea is that, so 4 sounds and 4 lights versus 4 sounds and 2 lights. If infants can conceive of number, then when the number of lights and sound are congruent, they should be more interested and they would look longer. So would they? A very simple question, yes or no. In the same way, we ask them, do they know anything about language? Do they prefer syllables like blog to bog? Do they prefer helpers to hinderers? And do they prefer happy faces to angry faces? The first 3 are considered epistemic states. Science tells us that all of them are present in very young infants, the first 2 in newborns. Lay people say, no way. But when you ask them about facial emotions, they should tell you, sure, yeah, newborn infants do prefer happy faces to angry faces. Last I checked, they don't. Not because emotions are innate, but simply newborns don't show facial preferences at this point. Data look like that. So emotions, sure, yeah. No moral cognition, no innate knowledge of number. Language, they're sitting on the face, probably because they think that phonology is all about talking. They're wrong, but yeah. So the question is why, right? Why are we blind to human nature? And a priori, there could be many reasons, right? So innocent ignorance, instinct blindness, mind reading blindness, social concerns, all of that have been suggested. They probably do play a role. But the challenge is that they don't explain the selectivity of the results. So why is it specifically innate knowledge, innate ideas that people don't think could be possibly innate? So here is what I suggest. Dualism plays a role, but not by itself. It has a friend, and together it's a terrible couple. So the friend is essentialism, as in the way I read the essentialism literature. Essentialism is the belief that living things are what they are because they have some hidden innate essence that they got from their parents, and it lies within their bodies. So to be innate, whatever is innate needs to be here. But the problem is that you're also dualist and you believe that knowledge isn't there. Knowledge is in the mind. So if to be innate, traits need to be in the body, knowledge ain't there, so knowledge cannot be innate. It is very simple, right? My lab has supported this idea in many experiments. For example, we have shown that when you satisfy essentialism by telling people that the psyche exists in the body and giving them evidence for that, people falsely jump to the assumption that the psyche is innate. So when you tell them it's in the brain, they assume it's innate. Of course, this is baloney. I've heard it spoken by very famous cognitive neuroscientists. But for lay people, for example, here we're telling them we are going to design this test of depression in which we tell them this is the test, and you show happy faces and angry faces, and the responses to happy faces are either seen behaviorally by a button press or in the brain as a brain spike. Not by localization. All you know is the brain is involved. It doesn't tell you any additional information here. And we ask people to predict how likely is it that depression runs in the family. And people tell you that when the evidence shows in the brain spike, people are significantly more likely to assume that depression is innate compared to the behavior. And this is completely wrong. It's entirely predicted by essentialism, dualism. You also see the same in natural association. So using the two groups we studied before, so we said if theory of mind is impaired, dualism is impaired. But critically, if dualism contributes to empiricism, then these groups should also show weaker empiricism and stronger nativism. This is indeed the case in both groups. So autistic people, when you give them the same traits and ask them to predict, are innate. And by the way, all traits that we use here are ones that are potentially could be innate. We don't know, but are not, it's not like driving. And what we'll find is that first, people are empiricists, they believe that epistemic traits aren't innate. But critically, autistic people are more likely to say that all traits are innate. So they are more nativist and less empiricist. Same thing for males versus females, empiricism again, and yet you see that males in the dark are more likely to accept innateness than females. So, so the great Leila Gleitman was right when she joked that empiricism is innate. It is probably anchored in innate systems of core knowledge. So this is bad enough, promoting empiricism, but I'm going to show you that dualism is also involved in a second conspiracy, which is igniting the hard problem of consciousness, nothing less. So we need to spend a second talking about that. So, the hard problem, right? The hard problem is the problem of explaining how consciousness emerges from the physical properties of the brain. So how does brain feel, basically? How does the meat on my head makes me have a feel of this rose as red, as luscious, as fragrant, right? How is that possible? Dave Chalmers famously claimed that consciousness cannot be fully explained in physical brain terms. He believes that consciousness is a special trait that is distinct from the physical. But then why there is a hard problem, right? That's the problem. And one possibility is exactly what I said, that consciousness is in fact distinct from the physical. So this is a fact about what exists, about ontology. The consciousness is different from the physical. But given what we said, perhaps we only think it is, right? Perhaps it's just something that is generated from within, from intuitive dualism. So which one is it? That's a problem, but to shed light on that, let's step back and move to a different example. So a woman steps into a bar. She takes her cell phone or a mirror. She wants to see how she looks like. She takes a look, and this is what she sees. That's a problem. Before running to the yard, you probably tell her, step outside and take another look, right? And if she still looks green, definitely get seen. But if she changes and now she looks okay, then you say, well, maybe it was a psychological illusion that was prompted by the lighting in the bar. And the logic is, when perception changes, you suspect the possibility of a psychological illusion. So we can apply the same logic to our problem, right? We can ask people to tell us whether consciousness is in the body, whether it is embodied, and see whether their intuitions shift as they did for the woman's face. And to do so, I presented them with two problems that philosophers have studied for a very long time. They're not exactly these problems, but you will see they're modeled after them. I will show you in a second. But first, the logic. These are two mirrors of lay people's intuitions about whether consciousness resides in the body. And if the results converge and they tell you that in both cases consciousness is distinct from the body, then you say, maybe it is ontology. Maybe consciousness really is not part distinct from the physical. But once you detect a shift, you should be very worried and consider the possibility that maybe psychology is at play. So, very briefly, the problem. We ask people, the first is a problem of a duplicate. So here is, suppose that in the future it would be possible to create a duplicate of a human body. Jane is about to get duplicated, but on her way to the duplication lab, she goes through the park and she sees this rose and notices its red color and its luscious petals and its sweet fragrance. And the question is, so we're then going to look at the duplicate and ask, can the duplicate access Jane's experience? Will it be able to conjure up Jane's experience with the red rose? For lay people, all these experiences involve specific epistemic states, and for them, epistemic states are distinct from the body, so they probably would think that these are not going to copy to the duplicate. We also ask them about consciousness generally and about psychological capacities in general, such as perception, thinking, and memory. So which of those will emerge in the duplicate? If they're in the body, they ought to emerge. What people tell you is that psychological capacities, yeah, they will emerge. Consciousness, not so sure. Conscious states, such as having conscious experience of the color, no way. So, for Jane's feel of the red rose, it looks like it's disembodied. People don't think that copying the body will copy. And then the question is it ontology or psychology? At this point, both are candidates. So to adjudicate between them, what you want to do is, will people say the same when you ask them about the second case, right? True intuition ought to be invariant. We don't have any reason for ontology to change here. So here I introduce them with a modified description of a second famous problem, which is Mary in the black and white room. So Mary is a philosophical rock star. She knows everything there is to know about color vision. She's a neuroscientist. She just knows everything except for she has never seen color herself. Why? Because she lives in this black and white room and she has never experienced color. So a neuroscientist decides to conduct an experiment. He invites Mary to step out of the black and white room, come to his lab, put her on the magnet, and presents her a rose for the first time, just to make sure that people don't think it's just a perception. The rose is then taken up, and Mary is asked to conjure up her experience with the red rose. The magnet runs. What will it detect? Same questions as before, and if those experiences are embodied, then they ought to show up, shine, and light in the machine. So what do people say? So in the case, what am I doing? Sorry, wrong direction. Here is Mary. Will she have psychological states? Yes. Will she have consciousness? Yes. Conscious states? Yes. Conscious states now will emerge in the body. So for Mary's case, now people think conscious states are embodied, contrary to what I just told you about Jane. And if their intuitions shift as they do, then psychology certainly play a role. And if psychology plays a role, then I would ask some serious questions about ontology here, right? And I believe that dualism plays a role here. For example, we see the shift stronger in females. Remember that they're more dualist. It's only females who actually say that Jane, the normal person, won't have conscious states. So all those strongly suggest that those intuitions arise from within. If you want to know why they shift, I'll tell you later. But the point is that they shift, and the shift is linked to dualism, and therefore you can't trust those intuitions to tell us about the hard problem, about what consciousness is, and I would strongly suspect that psychology at least had a role. So this is a pretty respectful history for dualism to do. I think we should be careful. But I want to end on a more positive note by telling you how dualism could actually be good for you and how it might be adaptive, because it is in fact linked to consciousness and the two are synergistic. Trigger warning, we are leaving terra firma. This is going to be totally speculative, but indulge me for a couple of slides. There will be experiment at the end, for sure. So here is the thing. A dualist holds at least two beliefs. And the first is about the mind being ethereal and separate from the body, and that's what we have discussed so far. But a dualist also has a belief about the self. You view yourself as ethereal, distinct from the body. You aren't meat. In fact, suggesting that you are, objectifying you, is going to be terribly insulting, as people do to women all the time, right? For instance. But the point is that these two beliefs are actually synergistic. So if you think about the logic of dualism, as a dualist becomes aware of her conscious states, becomes aware of what she feels and what she thinks, she essentially affirms her conscious sense of self. It tells her that, yes, I'm in that ethereal, distinct from the body. There's a big literature that shows that self-affirmation is good for you. It promotes self-consciousness. It promotes well-being. So this is a huge perk of dualism. Self-affirmation. It makes you feel like you are indeed who you are. So for example, as she has experiences of which she is aware, such as, I am in love, I know something, she has mental states that she believes to be ethereal. Who caused those mental states? Me, right? So if I'm the causer of those ethereal mental states, I must be ethereal as well, because mind and body can't interact. The causer must be ethereal as well. So as I experience those things, you conclude that I am ethereal precisely as I think I am. So this is how you get self-affirmation. No wonder that mindfulness has all these benefits, affective and health benefits as well as, all those are the psychological fireworks that begin with dualism. Implications, for the dualist, the life of the mind is good. All those things are good for you. They actually affirm who you think you are, which is good for your well-being. It also follows that changes to dualism could actually lead to psychopathology. And this is Jill Hooley, a clinical psychologist at Harvard, who was open-minded enough to indulge with me in these speculations, and we started testing these ideas in two projects. One is with transgender people, another is with non-suicidal self-injury, and here I'll just describe the first to just show you a hint of how dualism could actually explain psychological difficulties. So transgender people are of interest because what they do is basically align their identity with their mind, with their gender. Gender is a psychological construct rather than with their native sex, which is part of their body, right? So they show a stronger separation of their self-identity from the body. And the question is, if that's the case, are they more prone to dualism generally? So to find out, we presented them with the same two experiments using the same traits which had nothing to do with sex and gender, right? Same traits as before. In the body replication scenario, transgender and cisgender controls are exactly the same, absolutely no difference, which suggests that the two groups are in fact well matched. It's in the afterlife scenario and only for epistemic states where you see a very big difference. And the difference was so big that I had to go back and replicate the study because I couldn't believe it, but that's true. And when you think about it, this particular difference in this particular condition actually matches the way they think about their own gender dysphoria, right? So when a transgender person exhibits gender dysphoria and they need to resolve it, what they do is not affirm their body, but rather affirm their gender, which is in their mind. When asked what manipulation causes a person's psyche to persist, they suggest it's the one that preserves the mind in the afterlife rather than the preservation of the body. And the two things converge. So I was very excited about it, and I discussed it with my lovely daughter, Alma, who is a grad student here in the program in clinical psych, as well as her partner, Teresa, and they told me, go show it, right? Do something. That's not enough. They were totally right. So we measured gender affirmation and steps taken to social transition, and what we found was that the stronger the dualism, the stronger the affirmation of one's chosen gender, and the more steps a person took to socially transition. This is also preliminary. They don't tell you anything about causation, and even if they did, if there was causation, we are not sure in what direction. But they do suggest that mind-body intuitions could shed light on psychopathology. So conclusions. Dualism is a cognitive delusion. Yes, people are dualist. Dualism is natural. It totally ravages our cognition, but perhaps it's good for you. It's adaptive. It guides affective processing. I didn't tell you about that, and shapes the conscious self. Just one last thought. So have we shown that physicalism is true? Are mind and body surely one ontologically? No, I haven't shown that, and I don't know that whether it's true. I told you that I'm a psychologist, and I can't speak to that. Julian has some good arguments. You can read what he's saying, but in my mind, the fact that we show this delusion to think in this particular way should present a really strong reason to pause and think. And thank you for sharing this.
So I strongly agree with some of your main points. So when I teach like intro cognition, it's always very difficult to get across to people why modern scientists are materialists. Right? And essentially you have to deal with the fact that the students are intuitively think that mind and body are separate. Mm-hmm. And the whole point of cognitive science is a sort of a 2,000-year struggle to convince science that brains are machines rather than just being spirits or something like that. But that being said, a slightly pedantic distinction. That doesn't mean that we're dualists, right? Because dualist means that we believe there are exactly two things, two substances, whereas people may believe intuitively that there's more than two. They just think that there's mind and body.
You are minimally a dualist. I get it.
Right, minimally a dualist.
Right.
No, I think that's a pedantic distinction. But
sure.
What I mean is I think it's not so much that people are intuitively dualist as there's a larger lesson, which I think is what your story is, which is that people's intuitions come from innate models of the world, and there's often a conflict between that intuitive model and the scientific model. So that's a very old idea. That's like Ben Crossan, the scientific image versus the manifest image. That's that's an old observation. So I agree with the kind of flow of what you're saying afterwards there. That that whenever there's a conflict, it's very difficult to get ordinary people, even trained scientists, to drop their naive views, because after all they're all formerly naive.
As Newton did when he discovered gravity, basically. It was a very how can the force apply in a distance? Intuitive physics tells me it can't be. Totally. Thank you.
Another question.
So, I think I agree definitely on the conclusion, because we have a lot of these experiences where people do seem to be intuitive dualists. But I'm questioning some of the arguments, because some of the arguments, when I listen to them, seem like they were pointing towards people being intuitive physicalists rather than intuitive dualists. So one is Paul Bloom's, he says dualism emerges from the tension between intuitive physics and theory of mind. But think about, babies and human beings. We have intuitive physics, and we have experience in the world that is the world is composed of physical objects that are subject to intuitive physics. So couldn't that lead me to the opposite conclusion, that maybe my theory of mind is pointing towards something physical? Everything is physical, and intuitive physics tells me that things operate in the physical world. So maybe...
Are we confusing physicalism with intuitive physics? So intuitive physics is a belief about how objects behave.
Yeah.
It doesn't, physicalism is the belief that everything is physical.
Sure. But there's your lived experience, I guess, is that objects in the world that you can interact with are physical. Right? Like, we don't have any direct experience of things that are not physical.
Yeah. Correct. The intuitive physics is very likely innate.
So then that could lead us to the opposite conclusion, that like when I see something that I can't quite explain.
But it counteracts the theory of mind. You're not only, if you were, so indeed it's the case that if you're autistic and the intuitive physics is stronger than your theory of mind, indeed you can physically lean towards physicalism. Or at least you're more physicalist than control.
So the other thing is the allure of neuroscience and brain facts. And you listed that as another thing that might be a consequence of dualism, drive up at the end here. I think there's often a search for brain evidence. People often want to hear that there's brain evidence for certain things.
Yeah.
That sounds like people are demonstrating kind of intuitive physicalism. Why else would the brain facts matter?
I think it's not so much that it matters. So the people who are, baffled by seeing the brain light and the way, when I saw my first imaging of, you can't believe that you see the mind thinking in matter. Yeah, it's like you see a ghost. It's like a picture of a ghost. It literally, that's how a dualist would react. So you live your entire life with a problem. You don't understand how my thinking of this, my wishes can cause my hand to move. And all of a sudden you see, oh, this thinking is actually a physical thing. Great, now I understand. Now I solve the mind-body problem. So no wonder that you think neuroscience is great. Plus it tells you it's innate, which is another thing.
So people are intuitive dualists, but we want to find evidence of physicalism?
Right, because to solve your dualist dissonance of how mind can interact with bodies. So as a dualist, you all the time have evidence that the mental state can have physical consequences. And for you, mind and bodies can't interact. So you need an answer to that. And that's exactly what, so when you see the image in the brain, it's telling you, you know what? Your cognition, your belief, your epistemic state are actually physical states. And now you finally understand how they can have behavioral consequences because it's matter that interacts with matter. So that solves a huge problem for you. No wonder that you think it's great. Am I taking the question? And actually, we ran the experiments and showed. So we showed that the effect of the seductive allure is stronger where the dissonance is stronger, namely for epistemic state. So if you see, okay, I don't care. You can read the paper. I'm sorry, I don't. Michelle, can you please take? I don't know who.
Great, thank you so much. I really loved the talk. This is also on the topic of the emergence of intuitive dualism. So I totally saw how it would make quite a lot of sense if we had one system that told us about causal laws of interaction in the physical world, intuitive physics, and then we have a separate system, theory of mind, that gives us a separate set of causal laws, and those would lead to some intuitive dualism. But there's also the core agency system.
Yeah.
Which to me seems like, if not a physicalist system, at least a system where the agent, the self or the mind, is participating in the same kind of causal laws that move things in the physical world, so the self and the motion and all of that. Yeah. So I'm just curious how you thought about that working into the emergence of dualist intuitions. Like, does that lead to another kind of
I don't know.
intuition that's in conflict, or
very good question. I don't know for sure, but the way I tend to think about it, and I'll leave it to the expert chronology people, which I'm not. I would think about the theory of mind as kind of an offshoot of the agency system. So it begins with a minimal distinction between objects and agents, and then it further projects mental states to the agent by theory of mind. Makes sense, Alan?
I mean, that's in my view, it's a kind of a bridge between the physical object. Is that one of the things, isn't it?
Yeah, so all of that seems, to fit with your picture well, but I guess what the question was about how we represent other animate agents as interacting with each other in the world through self-propelled motion, not about representing others' mental states. And so, I can see that Michelle can throw a ball, and that ball, it doesn't have to have started by the laws of intuitive physics, it can be started by this agent.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
if
Yeah,
that's
so
another form of
agent-
innate
so-
representation, it seems like we have this.
So part of your belief about agents is that they have minds of their own and that can be distinct from yours, and everything, all these influences follow. So, yeah.
As far as I know, with babies, I think you could make a pretty good case that babies in the very earliest understanding of physical objects and the causal interactions, the whole thing pivots on contact. So there's something to the old idea that cause and effect is about contact. If you're Pavlovian, that's fine too. Contact in time and space. The thing about agent behavior, which implicitly pick up on remarkably early, is that you can't apply a principle. You can't expect agents to be acting and reacting to the world through contact in time and space, because they don't.
As you did show.
Right?
Yeah.
So
yes.
you need some different kind of brain mechanism to be sensitive to those kinds of actions at a little distance in space and a little distance in time, which I suppose gives you something like goal-directed action. And so that's again a bridge, but it's not yet mental states of fullness of knowledge and belief.
Yeah.
Pretense, actually, probably the key thing for babies to get to that higher level. Yeah.
Which, by the way, animals do as well.
Some of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, two remarks leading to a question. Remark number one is, I'm a tentative dualist. You can be a scientist and even a cognitive scientist and think the brain does lots of interesting things without being sure that it does everything all by itself. And then I'd like to ask you about the subjects that you got your judgments from, and I'll preface it with a story from a cognitive science thing that I went to long ago, where there was a guy who was doing reporting about twin studies and showing that practically all personality traits were innate or random, and culture, upbringing had very little to do with it, 2% of variance or something like that. But then he talked about, studies done at places like Harvard, which went through lots of traits and asked them what's innate and what's not innate, and they got every personality trait was acquired by nurture except sexual orientation. And I thought, okay, that's a great worldview, or something like that. But so, there's lots of cultures and lots of beliefs and lots of things that people at universities are encultured to. So, were you studying kind of weird people, or were you?
Yes, weird people.
Yeah, so I would
Weird in
wonder.
the sense of Western
So, like
educated.
20-year-olds and.
Also lots of mechanical Turk workers.
Okay.
So not the except university training, but no.
Did you
they're
screen
not-
for what their background is? So yeah, I would wonder whether that's really getting at base cognition? Are people really intuitive empiricists, for example?
So you are completely right to question the generality of my result. I haven't shown you the dualism is universal. I haven't gone to small-scale societies. Marcy Trudek did so and found some really interesting results. So yeah, we don't know,
anthropology
but we don't know. We don't know that, and give me the money, and I will do that. but my argument, but recognizing your concern, my logical tactic is different. So we don't know what people will do elsewhere. But what we could do is outline the mechanism and show that the mechanisms are anchored in chronology. And so far that we believe that chronology, we have evidence that chronology is innate, then you would not expect this to be only a weird phenomenon. I have not shown that, and you're completely right to challenge this and go to the experiments.
I was asking more about the intuitive empiricist than the intuitive dualist.
Both,
Yeah.
right? Because one leads to the other. So we have evidence that core knowledge has innate origins. We have evidence that essentialism emerges when the culture has contrary beliefs. All those have been shown. We don't know that so my story is dualism and essentialism conspire, and I'll show you, here's how dualism arises, it has innate origins, and I'm telling you that essentialism likely has innate origins, even though you don't see it at birth. Does it mean that the conspiracy will always happen in all cultures? I don't know, I haven't shown you that, and you are right to be skeptical about it.
Can I plug in myself advertisement? We don't have any evidence for small societies. We do have evidence that intuitive empiricism is present in people from India, from Japan, from children between 5 and 8 years old. So we don't have all the evidence. We have some evidence suggesting that it's very likely not limited to years old.
I was to ask from you to but actually, for me, it's very difficult to separate culture for the result. For example, I imagine the Mesoamerican culture that actually they don't talk about soul and body. They divide the self into 3 categories that doesn't have anything to do with the soul. So, for example, in this case, do you think the result is cross-validated by different cultures that doesn't have this idea of the dualism? Because I think this is very a Western idea, and it's very difficult that the results are not contaminated by the idea that it is.
We don't know of any culture that doesn't have beliefs in the supernatural. There are 2 possibilities. One is the supernatural exists ontologically, and the other is we make it up.
Yeah, but that depends on how people define supernatural, because the idea of supernatural is a Western idea.
No, it isn't. You find
No,
it.
but how you define or how you imagine what is supernatural is contaminated by the idea of how, if you have supernatural to other culture, is not exactly the same definition.
So the fact that you're right to claim that use of the supernatural varies. Still, supernatural by definition are phenomena that are not explained by the phenomena that are not explained by the laws of nature. Entities that can exert force without having a body, right? You see those beliefs cross-culturally, they're very prevalent. So this is, as I said, you want further evidence to link it. But I don't think that when you think about the reason why I think it may not be a strictly Western phenomenon is again because of the mechanisms of how it emerges.
I imagine, for example, in Mesoamerican culture, that actually the body is divided into an animal, a person, and a kind of substance, but it's not like a soul.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, there is immaterial things in those kind of self-components. And the other question is related with the theory of mind in animals. Actually, I think there is a lot of controversy about theory of mind in animals, because that also depends on how you define theory of mind and how you are going to measure the theory of mind is different. For example, when you put a monkey, or in a dog, or even an adult dolphin. So how
Look at-
reconcile all these.
So look at the evidence is controversial because you can speculate why the controversy exists, but the empirical evidence is there, and I find it very convincing. And it's very detailed, and it's very similar to the experiments that have been done to infer theory of mind in infants. So I see no reason to make any other conclusion with respect to animals.
Yeah, but for example, the measure is different.
The measure is different?
Yeah, if you measure, for example, it's not the same kind of test that you do in a monkey or in a dolphin, for example.
But these are tests that when you look at the logic of what is done, these are tests that show that the animal attributes mental states to others. So in ravens, when the male knows the female wants to eat something, so say salad versus steak. I don't remember how that's raven, right? So he knows that she likes salad and he likes steak. He will give her more of the salad when she knows that she wants salad. This is theory of mind. He knows about her.
In one domain, but
In one domain.
that theory of mind is to be extrapolated or different domain. That's the big controversy. Because you can measure with one single task, but that doesn't not mean that the animal can extrapolate that theory of mind on different activities.
So the evidence against theory of mind in animals that it doesn't generalize across tasks within that animal?
Yeah, I mean, I really like animal literature, and I was very interested in theory of mind, but the problem is the experiments are really, really messy because you can find different results depending on the species and also between individuals. So you cannot say that maybe one individual, one.
But there are statistical results that are published in many, many species, so how do you say that I don't know if we should have this discussion now, but we can look at specific papers, and there is a very large literature, which is in part controversial, but I think we need to be very specific about the claims that we make about it.
Thanks. I want to get a little clearer about just what you think people do. So it's one thing to think there are minds engaging some actions out there, and they're somehow governed by principles that are not the principles of intuitive physics.
Mm-hmm.
No delusion yet,
Mm-hmm.
because as we've known, like since the 17th century, the principles of intuitive physics don't govern
Right.
the physical.
Right. Correct.
So, and historically, the idea of dualism, as people tend to think about it, at least in the West, was very clearly like a 16th, 17th century thing where people were thinking there's physical substance and mental substance. And the mental substance is posited explicitly in contrast with the physical substance that was supposed to be governed by mechanical principles. The way people like that. And so there's a sense in which, since the 17th century, after Newton, we say, yeah, the problem with dualism was positively physical substance. For sure. That's got it. And now the question is, what's out there?
Yeah.
And so if people are feeling that there is a tension between their intuitive psychology and their intuitive physics, whence the delusion and why blame the theory of mind?
I don't, so as I acknowledged at the end, I can't speak to ontology. But you will give me the argument. So Dave Chalmers' work is one of the strongest arguments for dualism, for property dualism, right? If that one goes, you tell me what is the evidence for.
But I wasn't trying to talk about ontology. I was trying to figure out.
Oh, I see.
I'm trying to figure out. When somebody says, I'm deluded something, it makes me think I've got some propositional content that's wrong. And I'm trying to figure out what on your view the content is that the ordinary person has that's wrong.
So it's wrong in the sense that it probably does not speak to ontology.
I just want to know what's wrong in it, because there's one thing which you showed, I think, quite persuasive, that people feel there's this tension.
Yeah.
And lots of reasons think there's tension between your intuitive perception of mind and your intuitive perception of body. That doesn't mean your intuitive perception of mind is yet wrong.
Correct. I don't know, what I'm saying is, but, so, I don't directly speak to ontology. Technically, what I speak is the meta problem, right? About how we think about ontology and show that our thinking about
I
ontology.
didn't say anything about it.
But how?
say
But
anything
you're
about-
saying you're
I didn't
asking
say
me how do I
anything-
know it's a delusion?
Well, let me put it this way. There's a lot of talk about people being dualists.
Uh-huh.
And that's one of what's the evidence that the ordinary person is thinking that there are substances in any interesting sense? Or, Jake was saying, maybe they think they're 17 and innate, but why is it that we're thinking people, it's not professional 17th century philosophers, we're thinking in terms of there being substances.
That's exactly how
and
they're
think-
acting. They are acting as if there were different substances. They're acting as if there are different causal principles that affect the physical and the mental.
That's why I was making that distinction. People, I think, intuitively, before they are scientifically educated, think that mind and body are separate. That doesn't mean that they think that there's only two things in the universe. And so, I mean, to kind of answer Paul's question, I think what we're saying is that the delusion is that people think that mind and body are separate.
Yeah.
Whereas in fact, they're not separate, they're all material. That, of course, is a Western scientific
Yeah,
claim.
right.
I suppose we all believe, although maybe not all. But I mean, the idea that it's a delusion is just an assertion of Western science, meaning it's not inherently true. It's just an opinion.
So I think we're raising several questions. One are there only two substances, right? That's problem one, and the problem two is whatever this is the belief in at least two is a delusion. Right? Two separate questions. I don't know if they.
You think you're not addressing the question of whether it's delusional because you're not making an ontological claim.
Although I am making, although even so, what I'm saying is that given that our beliefs about ontology are contaminated by psychology, the burden is on the philosopher, the claim from ontological claims to produce evidence that is not tainted by those psychological biases. And given that psychology is such that intuitive dualism is such a bias, there is a very high likelihood that it generates some of those beliefs, although I remain, agnostic.
But that's why it's a difficult historical struggle to get
Yes.
people on board with moments like we can say
Yes.
this. Because, right, so I mean, in that sense, I kind of agree. The intuitive, let's say, non-materialism that people have is always pulling us back. So, yeah.
Okay, so the monistic substance that science has taught us that there is, that's the monistic substance that I learned about in physics classes.
Well,
I just want to be clear with the content of my I was thinking there aren't substances.
That's supposed to be the claim. Whether that's really correct, it's I would agree, but that's the backdrop of it. I think this argument that science has sort of landed on strict materialism as the right answer.
No, but I just want to understand. I know materialism sort of meant in the 17th century. I confess, as a professional philosopher who sometimes dabbles in metaphysics, I don't know what we mean by materialism in the 20th and 21st century. But I just want to get clear. What you mean by materialism is something like quantum electrodynamics, right?
Well, that was sort of my personal thing.
No. For the purposes we say science has landed on physics on materials. So it's that.
So I think this goes back to Ryan's question about why do people get excited when there's an image of in a neuroscience journal that shows that something is real, because that seems to demonstrate some kind of physicalism that the whole field is constantly trying to demonstrate because we're trying to escape from our roots as naive dualists. So
Well, that's maybe why you're excited, but why we lay people are excited is because they too, because it's the same dilemma, right? How can my mental state have physical
yeah,
consequences?
and I think you're using the word lay a little fuzzy there because a lay educated person is on board with trying to demonstrate that science is right, whereas an average human being across cultures maybe would be more excited to demonstrate that some cultural bias.
Well, if it were correct, and if it was just the scientific merit, then you would expect that people would be equally excited to discover that epistemic states have brain correlates and perceptions have brain correlates. They don't. People are much more excited to discover that the epistemic states, the ones that they typically intuitively believe are ethereal, actually have brain. So that is not science. Plus, who is the one that gets excited by the images? Are the people who care about string theory about, no, these are people who don't have general, I mean, this is just intuition, right? This is anecdotal, but my sense is that everybody gets excited by the brain, regardless of how much we care about the physical world.
The New York Times definitely went through a phase of, lovers in the brain.
Yes, dyslexia's in the brain.
Yeah.
Surprise, surprise. Yeah.
I thought it was so you could ask for lots of money to get a neuroscanner.
Yes, exactly. That also is true. Yeah, that whole story about how became an industry of indirect costs. Yeah.
So, in your work, have you had groups that were scientists or who claimed to be scientists? You like that, yeah.
Well, I didn't have anything about dualism. I have no idea, no data on dualism, but scientists are also empiricists.
Right.
Cognitive science.
Cognitive.
Right, but the important thing is this, whether you've ever heard about how Descartes' dualism collapsed because the notion of physical substance collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
And really all you have is sort of mathematical substance left.
Yeah.
Well, that covers mind too,
Yeah.
as well as surprise
Yeah. Yeah.
objects. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
and what's left of
Yeah.
objects. There are no objects. That's the thing that if you had made that move,
Yeah.
and yet you were a dualist,
Yeah.
just like the folk, I don't know if that word's used anymore, but the folk, the private just as they do too. So that might support the idea of the word delusion, which I just always assumed
Yeah.
really a
Which is-
rhetorical
that is
move.
Chomsky's
It's very
move.
cute, rhetorical move. We're deluded, right?
Which is, that's basically Chomsky's move, when he
Yeah.
goes in and questions the physical. Yes.
Right.
I think Cal had a question.
Thanks for having this. It was really cool. I mostly had what I took to be a friendly suggestion about one of the things you might think was going on with your gender dysphoria data, and then a worry about the same thing. So the first thing is, I thought your point about the interaction between essentialism and dualism was really helpful. And I thought with respect to the gender dysphoria data that interaction again might be coming into play. So one of the things you could think might be happening in the gender dysphoria data is that when you have transgender people, there is a push to try to explain gender as located somewhere, right? And so rather than sort of locating it where the vast majority of society does in the body, you're forced to put it somewhere else. And well, what does dualism tell you? It says, put all of your essentialism bucket with regard to gender in the mind, right? And so you might think that what's happening for like the folk psychology that some people have when they like are sort of considering gender dysphoria and trying to sort of make sense of their own gender, is that it's a shift in terms of like what you take to be the essentializing feature, right, with regard to gender. This, at least in feminist philosophy, and philosophy of gender is a pretty common take, right? To think that like really what society is doing is pushing you in this direction. That being said, I do actually think that literature gives you a bit of a worry as to like what the data in that study is tracking, and that's in part because I take it that one of the things that a lot of like feminist philosophers who work on gender say is that one of the things that you see a lot of colloquial and like public arguments that like being transgender is a real phenomenon and it's a real category because your gender is not just your body, because people really are like searching for something to attach that essential gender category to, and so I worry that there's some extent to which part of what you're picking up on in that study is people's social expectations about like what gender should be perceived as, right? Like what their gender needs to be perceived as, rather than how you actually take it. So like one of the things that you find in the philosophy literature, for example, is when you start giving people the opportunity to take their like physical attributes, their attributes of their body, and reconceptualize them or re-identify them under masculine and feminine traits, that people are a lot more liberatory in terms of like what they're actually sort of willing to like what they're willing to see as in a particular gender bucket. So like one of the approaches with regard to gender dysphoria is not just social and medical transition, it's also to say like, hey, it's not just the case that like penises are masculine, right? Like, and so there's like a huge history going back to like the 1960s and 1970s of like trying to like rethink some of the ways in which, for example, like butchness in the 70s, right, is a kind of masculinity that is embodied in these like prototypically feminine ways, and vice versa. And so the suggestion is just the like initial data is super cool and interesting. I'm like the afterlife stuff is fascinating, but I do wonder the extent to which you're picking up on people's on transgender people's feelings of social constraint, right? So like, what is it that I'm required to say to cis-facing people about my own body and about my own expectations of my experience? Because it's way easier, I would think, to tell like a cis public like, yeah, my brain's masculine, right, than to like sort of give you the nuance of the way that the experience actually works. Does that make sense?
Thank you for the comment. So start with the locally, what the results are telling us. The results are telling us something about the perception of the psyche as anchored in the mind rather than in the body. I'm not talking about gender identity. I didn't ask for the most part. Most of the study is about beliefs about how the mind relates to the body. And in matters that have nothing to do with gender identity, transgender people perceive the mind as if it is more ethereal, as if it's more distinct from the body. So that's the starting point. It's not like it's more embodied, it's more distinct from the body. In general. Okay.
Right.
Hold on.
Mm-hmm.
How does it relate to their own attitudes about the self? I did not study that in depth, and I solely accept a person's, it's the person's right to tell me how they feel, and not, I'm not going to tell them. However, they use the term essence, and use it in a way that is a little different than the way I define it. So it's a very, so they're talking about two parallel things. And this reflects a problem that you see in the essentialist literature generally. People use essence for everything, and I don't find it useful. People use essence for, prototypical. My colleague John Colley says it's just like a way of categorization. So why do you use it? I'm talking cognitive science, for example. Right? Why do you need essentialism? Why don't you talk right? When I read the literature about children cognition, my understanding is that people anchor whatever this thing that the child gets from its mother in the body. That's what the result, how I read the result to imply. If that's the case, essentialism as I use it here is a statement about the body. It's not a statement about this is who I really am in general. So we are talking two different things. Do transgender people think that I am really who my body is? We need to talk further, but at least the choices that they take to transition, they do not affirm the natal body for them. This is not the most, let's say that right, conversion therapy is really not a good thing that transgender people like. So
I think the worry is that the distinction is the bifurcated distinction. Do you identify with your body? Do you not identify with your body? Is probably too coarse-grained of a distinction to get you like results that are like really gonna hook up to like to people's identities. And so I think the worry is what you have is you have trans people sort of giving you like, yes, it looks like the mind is much more ethereal, right? Like it looks like they're much bigger dualists. But you might think that the reason that they're coming out looking like bigger dualists is because when faced with a super transphobic society in this way, like what's the sort of
Perhaps.
orientation you have toward defense of your own identity,
Perhaps.
right? The simple one.
Perhaps.
And that's not necessarily gonna.
Yeah, I don't know why they are the way, why they behave in this way, for sure.